Hi, everybody. Welcome to our third academic hot topics of 2022. My name is Brandon Drain, and I'm the communications lead at the MSU A-CAPP Center. And I'm stepping in place of Carrie today because she's sick. So we're going to continue to keep this thing rolling. And as a reminder, we designed these sessions to be an in depth conversation with some of our academic partners and fellows who are doing relevant research to brand protection and anti counterfeiting. These events are free and open to anyone in the field of brand protection. Um, we are recording these sessions, and I would encourage you all to use our questions feature to ask questions to our guests whenever the prompt arises, and we'll do our best to um, get those in for the guests. This event is supposed to be a part of our outreach program, which focuses on topics relevant to brand protection. Um, and a reminder to those who may know that we also have our Brand Protection Professional online magazine, which is our publication, and is publishing its newest edition later this month. Our Brand Protection Stories podcast with Leah Everett Burks, which just dropped last week, a new episode featuring Chris Salgado, as well as our Brand Protection Professional Certificate. We also have a robust student internship program training the next generation of brand protection professionals and practitioners. If any of you are interested in hiring one of our students or recent grads, please reach out to Carrie, Jeff, or myself. And a special thank you to everyone at the center who helped make this possible: Carrie, Leah, Sarah, Jeff, and so on. And I would like to thank our gold sponsor of the event series today, Abbott. Um, I'm excited to speak with you today, Tim, about the research and perspectives on the detection of illegal online sales of controlled substances and counterfeit drugs. Our guest today, Tim Mackey, is a professor of global health in the Global Health Program at UC San Diego in the Department of Anthropology, and the director of Global Health Policy and Data Institute, and the editor in chief of the JMR Infodemiology. Please feel free to reach out to any of us to read or our complete bios and whatnot. And feel free to look on the website for that as well. Um, Tim, how are you? I know you have a presentation for us earlier, so I'm going to let you take the reins on that.
Great, sounds good. Thanks so much, Brandon, for the introduction and for the invitation to join this series. John was just on the last session talking about online pharmacies, so this is a great way to segue over into a little bit of additional information around how illicit drugs are sold online. And we'll be focusing today on controlled substances. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I know this is kind of atypical for A-CAPP sessions, but I thought some visuals might be helpful in setting up the conversation that we're going to have around brand protection and how it can apply to a lot of these principles can apply to brand protection professionals as well, though a lot of the work we're doing is really specific to public health challenges. Can you see my screen okay?
All good.
Okay, great. So we're going to be talking about the latest trends and detections of illegal online sales of controlled substances. And just to give you a reminder of who we are, I'm a professor at UC San Diego, and I run a lab, an academic lab that works on different types of public health challenges. And one of those challenges is, of course, drug diversion and counterfeiting. So I've been doing a lot of research in that space, and more recently doing more work on the term of infodemiology, where we're using different types of digital media to identify different patterns in public health. But in addition to the academic research that we do, we also have a startup that's funded by the National Institutes of Health, which is, its main purpose is to essentially take a lot of that academic research that we're doing and translate it in a way that can be used for maximum impact. So we are in the middle of a SBIR phase 1, phase 2, and that includes us working with different partners, different stakeholders, technology companies, the government, and using this technology to interdict the sales of illicit opioids online. So the general methodology for this approach is we use big data social listening on multiple social media platforms, internet sites, and other digital sources such as the dark web. We take all of that data, we use machine learning, natural language processing, and hybrid methods to characterize those online topics, trends, and behaviors. And of course, one of those primary use cases is looking for illicit drug sellers. We then do in-depth interdisciplinary analysis of multiple data features. And we've done a lot of different projects on things as broad as substance use disorder, COVID, opioids, even HIV drugs, all types of things we're looking at. We're looking at clinical trials and why certain ethnic minorities don't enroll in clinical trials. So the methodology is very flexible to a lot of different public health topics. And then, of course, the last part of that solution is to tool it in a way that we can build dashboards, data intelligence, and ways to translate that public health intelligence in a way that people can use it. So, unfortunately, one of the reasons why the company exists and why the lab does the work it does is because we're in the middle of a public health crisis. And that is the opioid and fentanyl crisis, including massive fentanyl poisoning that's going across throughout the nation. In fact, the CDC just released its preliminary data to show that we did have an increase of 100,000 people who projected to die in 2021 due to overdose death. And a lot of that is, of course, being caused by synthetic opioids like fentanyl. So understanding this whole ecosystem is very important to us, not just understanding one part of the ecosystem, but how that ecosystem interacts with itself. So when we look at illicit sellers online of different products, we are primarily focusing on drug dealers, but again, a lot of these lessons can be imputed to other types of counterfeiting and illicit sales. But the social media layer is very important to us because it's one of those spaces where users market their services, their products, and they want to reach the broadest group of users they can. So a lot of our sellers are multi-channel social media marketers. They're on multiple platforms at one time, and they're not exclusive to using a particular platform for a particular marketing strategy. It's a lot of crossover. It's a lot of very dynamic accounts and a lot of, a large presence on these different platforms. And then, of course, the internet is a place where customers search for products and services, and they use the clear web and e-commerce sites to basically post their products. So this is a different modality of where people can search for information and where they can be exposed to different types of sales products, including drugs and opioids. And then, of course, the last layer is one of those layers where we look at, which is more clandestine, harder to reach for most consumers, but still not that hard to access. And that's the dark web. And that's where a lot of sellers also do more B2B or maybe a little bit of B2C, but they're in this business to, tap into that particular marketplace and where people get very curated information about illicit products. And then some of our sellers, of course, on all three platforms are all three layers. They're on social media, they're on the internet, they may have a website, and they also have a purported dark web account. So one of the other things we're really interested in is understanding how we prioritize certain sellers over others. And we're looking for high activity sellers. So some platforms may act as that marketing layer, but the transaction layer for that actual drug sale may happen on a different platform. And the marketing layer refers to that transaction layer. And then those multi-platform dealers are basically using this whole ecosystem to both market and transact in the sale of their products. So we can track that information across multiple platforms. And the idea is to identify higher activity and higher risk and prioritize target identification so that we're not looking at 120,000 sellers, but we're looking at maybe 10,000 sellers that are the highest risk based upon these different parameters. And again, on the dark web, we're also looking for how there's digital exhaust coming out of these different types of sellers. So a seller might be on the dark web, but they may also have a presence on the clear web. And from there, you can find identifying information about how to find a dark web seller that may be harder to identify, but because they're on the clear web, we can find additional information about them, and that may be a risk factor for a clear web seller also being on the dark web and being a seller that we really want to prioritize. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, translating that into some sort of translational element where we have a dashboard and companies can use it and understand it. And of course, one of the other things that's most important to us is having that community outreach. So working with organizations like the Milken Institute. We went to a training, we were invited to a training with the FBI for their J-Code annual conference, doing some of the translation for misinformation and telling consumers what to look for when it comes to misinformation around COVID-19 related products and online health scams. And a recent People magazine article where we were featured in talking about which type of emojis that parents should look out for. And then really happy that we were a member of the National Fentanyl Awareness Day that just occurred last week. And that component is really critical. It's getting that information out there to consumers, educating them, and making sure they're aware of the dangers of controlled substances being sold online and fentanyl poisoning. And that's important because you're obviously getting to the demand side, because the best practices are to do this health education promotion to address demand side, demand for these type of products and educate consumers about the risks, but also do internal and external surveillance for platforms themselves so they know what's going on, and then have a whole of internet kind of approach to understanding what that risk environment looks like. So I'll jump out of the presentation, and I apologize. There's a little bit of echo and feedback from my side, so I can hear my voice talking. So it's distracting me a little bit when I'm trying to present. So apologies about that.
Thank you, Tim, for that presentation. I mean, one of the biggest issues that we have seen in recent history is the rise of fentanyl, and it seems that you guys are, kind of focusing directly right in there from the source. But what are some other aspects of your research that you'll add to this, or maybe you've talked about before, that are some of the whole things that you're looking at? What is another aspect of your research that's taking up a big portion of what it is you guys are doing?
Yeah, I'd say our primary use case is definitely opioid sales online. That's what the government funds us to do and to develop the technology that we're doing through S3. But a lot of the approaches we use are being used for different use cases. And so we did work on wildlife illegal products being sold online, and that is a very different commodity market. We've also done some consumer goods, looking at how consumer goods are represented on these different platforms. And we do a lot of work on vaping now on the academic side, because vaping is a big issue when it comes to different regulatory changes that the FDA is implementing, such as sales bans on certain flavored products, and also just the changing, emerging dynamic of that market where you have new products being introduced all the time. So a lot of these principles apply. You can basically take a keyword or hashtag or any type of code word, impute it into social listening scrapers, identify content that is related specific to selling and marketing, and then characterize those sellers in a way that you understand how they're acting across the whole of the internet. And that's really what we feel is one of the most important things in the brand protection space, is not focusing on enforcement on just one platform, but really understanding how those dynamics occur across platform, which platforms are used for certain issues, like for marketing or for reaching consumers or for building your customer list, for example. And then the other platforms that are used more for transaction layer, like our encrypted application types of spaces like Discord and Telegram, which we do a lot of work in right now, where the conversations are much more specific to actual selling and buying. There's ratings of drug sellers, there's proof of delivery, those type of things. That fidelity of information, understanding how it interacts with more of the traditional social media space, we think is very important.
And before I get to this question asked by one of our guests, I wanted to touch on that a little bit more. So the baseline for social media, like the Snapchats, the Instagrams, and whatnot, act as like a funneling tool for these other more decentralized kind of social media platforms that are easily able to, disseminate all this information, what transactions going. How hard is it from one layer to another? Let's say, for instance, like Telegram, how hard is it to really permeate that layer and try to get some valuable information from what's going on and to stop it from there, essentially, because of how decentralized it is?
Yeah, it's a very complex form of methodology that we use, where we're basically, looking at the whole of the internet to find people that are actively marketing product. But because those people are marketing product, they're going to have multiple modalities for you to engage with them. So that could be Telegram, it could be Snapchat, it could be Discord, it could be Wicker, it could be WhatsApp, it could be any of these modalities. So you have to really look at the full scope of where they're marketing, and the consumer actually has choice about where they want to interact with that seller. So the first layer, again, as we talked about, is that marketing layer. That is a different approach to data collection. It's keyword based, it's hashtag based, it's code word based, etc. But then when you get into these encrypted apps, it's mostly spaces where people are having discrete conversations in group settings. And so that approach to identifying those groups that you want to collect information from, to identify intelligence that can help with an actual investigation, like for, say, having shipping information about product coming from one place to another because there's proof of shipping, or other types of transaction related details that can help with an active investigation, you really have to pinpoint the groups that you want to look at. And so it's a very different data collection process. It's a multi-stage process. So one process is larger, big data collection assisted with machine learning. And then, of course, human annotation that goes through that and tries to identify intelligence points that can be used to identify other sources of even higher fidelity information. And then that higher fidelity information then has to be translated into something that someone can use. So a lot of times we're identifying certain pieces of data that we think a partner might be concerned about or can act on. So it's a very iterative process. And again, it starts with that large catch of a lot of data. It goes down into which data is usable for an investigation, and then it pinpoints these data points which can be actually used to identify a seller or potentially take an enforcement action.
For sure. Thank you for answering that. That was on my portion. But we have another question coming in from Kevin Chow. He says, I do a lot of online searching for all different types of pharmaceuticals for sale. What is the best methodology for searching the clear web? I have limited success, and I'm just wondering if I'm missing something. The dark web is much simpler to find such things, which I spend much time on.
Yeah, the dark web is a space where it's very highly structured data. The marketplaces are organized in a way that it's very product specific, but you do get a little bit of product crossover in different marketplaces. And of course, one of the challenges in the dark web space is that the marketplaces do get taken down quite a bit. But the dark web also has a search function called DuckDuckGo that indexes some dark web sites. So you have blogs and other types of content that is not related to the marketplaces where you can find additional content. But generally, it's a relatively structured environment. Versus the internet, we look at the internet from a search perspective. So we're searching for certain keywords or certain search strings, and we're scraping the sites that are showing up, and then we're identifying internet sites that are selling product. So that's a very different collection approach as well. But it's very similar to what a human analyst would do by hand searching, but it's just at scale. It's all the time. Our approaches are always running at any given time to make sure that we're collecting the most recent data. We're collecting any metadata associated with those particular internet sites. So you can, kind of assume what's going on is it's like 100 machines or 200 machines running searches all the time and collecting that data in a way and compiling in a way that we can understand everything that's going on across the internet. And the social media space is a little bit more dynamic because that content can go up, it can be removed pretty quickly, and then it can also, change over time. So the hashtags that, for example, online sellers use for the opioid space is constantly changing. So if you are working off of an old set of keywords, then you're probably not going to find content. That's because you're not in touch with what the community is talking about in those issues, or which hashtags link to certain drug selling related activity. So one of the things that we do is we do hashtag and keyword analysis to determine which hashtags and keywords perform the best when it comes to detecting illegal sales related content. So just always having that dynamic search approach, having the large scales of data available to use to analyze, and then doing more in-depth characterization of how that market is evolving and moving. Because if you're not always monitoring it, it's going to evolve away from you, and you're not going to see new trends, new approaches, new platforms that emerge, and that's really important for us as well. Because one of the things that these sellers do is they do react to enforcement, and certain platforms have more enforcement than others. Sometimes they react because the market gets more competitive, So there's lots of things that you have to constantly be vigilant of and tracking all the time in order to understand how those markets change. And if you don't do that, then your human searches or your hand searches probably won't be effective because you won't be finding the content you're looking for.
I hope that answers your question, Kevin. And to kind of transition towards that, um, John spoke on the last hot topics about some of the illegal online pharmacies being on that first page when you search on the clear web on Google. And what are, like, as a consumer, what are some of the steps that one can take in order to ensure that you're kind of mitigating your access towards these fake online pharmacies? What are some of the practical steps that consumers can take if those first few pages are in fact illegal online pharmacies?
Yeah, there's a lot of different tools available to mitigate consumer, risk when it comes to being exposed to online pharmacies. But some of them are run by things like the National Association of Board of Pharmacy, which has a .pharmacy. So you know that if you go to a .pharmacy website, this is the generic top-level domain like a .com or .edu, but it just says .pharmacy, that you know you're going to a legitimate pharmacy because that domain space is controlled and regulated by NABP. So that's one space where if a consumer knew, hey, if I need to buy drugs online, I need to go to .pharmacy, then they would be protected. And there's also other ways, the NABP has a not recommended list that people can cross-reference. But the reality is most consumers don't care. They're just looking to find product. And a lot of times what we see is they're typing in information about a disease state, like, I'm worried I might have COVID, so here are my symptoms. And then from there, they're reading information about what treatment is available. And then the next step they're going to take is look for that drug and see if it's online, because either, they're concerned about, their health and their family, or they can't get access because maybe they don't have adequate access to prescription drug benefits. Or for example, they may actually just want to get it right away. They might want to address that issue right away. Or again, there could be a shortage in the market where that product is not available. So we saw a lot of that at the beginning of COVID-19. We saw a lot of fake testing kits being sold because there wasn't a lot of testing availability or capacity at the beginning of the outbreak. And so, if you were a bogus seller, that was your time to scam consumers. It's just you had to do it. So those factors don't really impute to, well, we can educate our way out of this, or we can use these tools to inform consumers, hey, it's dangerous to do this. Like, consumers are going to consume the information that they have in their information diet. And a lot of times that information may be bad information, misinformation, and then it can lead them to this illicit selling space. So it's a combination of things. I think you have to educate to a certain extent, but the real tools that are important are, more progressive ways to remove this content, to delist it, to make sure it's not ranked high on search engine results, and to identify it in a way that platforms understand that they have a responsibility to remove it or take it down. And a lot of times the platforms themselves are not going to do that, but if there is information or services that can point them to, this is in fact information that's violating terms and policies, or something from a trusted notifier, for example, then you can effectuate removals a lot quicker.
And I guess to string along with that same notion that we were just talking about, we have a question here from William Mansfield asking, what responsibility do pharmaceutical companies have in fighting fakes? And which company does the best job of it? I'm not sure if you have the answer to that one, but
Yeah, so we've in my academic career, I've talked to a lot of different pharmaceutical security directors. I think all of them have different approaches. There's not necessarily uniformity, I would say, across capacity. So some companies may have more capacity to do drug diversion, enforcement than others. It's very therapeutic specific. So some drug companies have very expensive therapeutics that might be, especially oncology products, for example, or there may be products that are just more susceptible to counterfeiting. So, for example, we see a lot of counterfeiting in the anti-infective space, especially in least developing countries. And so companies also have to identify what are their priorities. Is it kind of physical drug diversion, counterfeiting, et cetera, and then how they deal with the online space, which is a secondary space of distribution. So I couldn't say who does the best, but I know a lot of these companies are putting, significant resources forward, but at the same time, they have to prioritize what's in their portfolio. So a lot of times we're looking at pharmaceutical companies that are prioritizing branded products that they have as a proprietary product, versus there are a lot of counterfeiting of generic products as well. So some of that space is not policed as well, even though a lot of consumers are impacted by it more heavily. And so we've done studies that looked at, for example, fake antibiotics being sold online, and seeing what the representation of those sellers look like. We actually did do test buys for that project. We haven't published it yet, but it's in process. And we found that a lot of these products were in fact falsified. They didn't have the API stated, and they had other excipients that were very dangerous. So in that space, it's generic antibiotics. There's not really anyone that is going to police that space. And for the larger pharmaceutical companies, again, it really depends on their capacity, on their priorities. I think a lot of that also relates to other secondary markets. Like we do a lot of research and services in Chinese language. So we're looking at, for example, fentanyl precursors and importation things. So a lot of companies may also be looking more specific to certain markets that they're concerned about, whereas in other markets they're less concerned. So suffice to say, I think there's a lot of variation in how companies approach these issues, but all of pharmaceutical companies have to worry about illicit drug diversion in their supply chain, because it's just the new reality of where we are in a digitized pharmaceutical supply chain.
Of course. I hope that answers your question. And we have another one strumming in right now that asks, what other relationships do you see between the rise of decriminalized cannabis in some states and the sale of those products potentially laced with fentanyl on social media?
Yeah, unfortunately, fentanyl can be laced in anything. It could be Adderall, it could be Xanax, it could be an opioid, it could be these emerging CBD products. We do see a lot of that. So we are doing research on something called Delta 8, Delta 9. These are, synthetic cannabinoids, and synthetic cannabinoids have been around for a long time. There's K2 spice, things like that. So what happens is, of course, states are regulating and, legislating cannabis-related access, either for medical purposes or recreational purposes. And consumers are confused about what product is legal or not. And that is even harder to identify when you get into synthetic marijuana, like Delta 8, Delta 9. So there's a lot of discussion on online boards where people are saying, well, this product's legal. And because it's legal in my state, it's legal in your state, or it's not being enforced, or because it's a synthetic, it's natural, it's legal as well. And so we do see a lot of these online product sales. And the risk factor that we see is that a lot of these CBD products are also being co-marketed with other opioid products, without a prescription. So that tends to indicate that there's some risk that this seller could be involved both in, opioid sales and also cannabis sales. So that crossover could mean that that product is also laced with fentanyl, for example. And unfortunately, we don't see a lot of users self-reporting, I got a CBD product and I overdosed from, a fentanyl product, or I had fentanyl poisoning, because there's still a lot of stigma related to that. And of course, there is a criminality component related to that as well. So, the unfortunate part is that fentanyl is being laced into everything. It could be CBD, it could be Delta, it could be anything like that. And that space of cannabis legalization is confusing a lot of the market, not just for the risk of fentanyl, but for other drug-related products as well. So certain states have taken action to try to restrict sales, but when it comes to sales online, it's very hard for these states to restrict sales that are coming from outside of a jurisdiction outside of their particular state. So it's definitely a risk. It's worth monitoring more. But we're not sure exactly what that co-occurrence looks like, but we do see a lot of co-occurrence of marketing.
For sure, and especially with the amount that creates an overdose in those cases, and as this decriminalization continues to rise and permeate, and as businesses continue to market, that's definitely something to keep an eye on as those two crossroads intersect.
Yeah, and I would just add that the cannabis commercial market is an interesting market for a lot of cannabis providers, like the large companies like Leafy, et cetera, where it makes a lot of sense for them to do a little bit more proactive protection of their supply chain, because they have quite a bit of overhead to sell legal cannabis, and a lot of the cannabis market is actually, is having a hard time with capitalizing, because there were some decisions by FDA about putting CBD into more consumer products, so that depressed the actual value of a lot of cannabis and hemp related agricultural products. And so what I think is important in that space is that sellers that are regulated, that are registered with their local state authorities, they would probably want to have a little bit more protection of the supply chain to make sure that only legal sellers that are meeting those standards that are required are able to sell online. But the reality is we do see a lot of looks like illicit sellers online in the cannabis space, and that may be cutting into kind of the more controlled market for those products.
For sure. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. We have
Mhm.
another question from Peter Gomper, who asks, has there been research on the incentivization of consumers as a mechanism to reduce the risks of counterfeits and illicit products, outside of education and public outreach, which focus on awareness alone?
That's a great question. I haven't seen much research that uses like behavioral economics to try to incentivize or to introduce an intervention to make a change of behavior in consumers, whether it be in a simulated, kind of environment where you're simulating an online purchase or simulating someone clicking through a marketing ad that talks about buying drugs without a prescription, for example. You see more studies that look at the content characteristics of the sites themselves, and also the content characteristics of the educational and health promotion activities that are going on and their effectiveness. The question, I think, in a study like that is, exactly what is that intervention going to look like? Is it some sort of, kind of rebate or cash or economic consideration where you're trying to incentivize someone to buy the product from a legitimate source versus an illicit source? And what is the kind of modulation you need for that cost? Like, how much does the delta have to be? If the price is cheaper online by $20, do you give them $1 incentive to buy from a legitimate source and you redirect them? Is there some other kind of intervention that's non-economic based, that's really more focused on redirecting them to better sources of information, and then incentivizing them to consume that information and include that in their information diet? Those are all great questions. I'm not exactly sure if that's been done more on the more other consumer space. What I will say is that the dynamics of those interventions are very product specific. So for drugs, yes, we do drugs. We do a lot. We do pharmaceutical products. We do opioids. But even within the drug space, opioids and, for example, oncology products, and the way that people sell them online is completely different. So if you move across different product areas, such as wildlife is completely different space for us. Gun sales online, completely different, and the regulatory framework for gun sales, whether it be ghost guns, parts, components, etc., that's very different as well. So that intervention really has to be tailored to a particular product type, the consumer behavior that emanates from that particular product space, and the characteristics of how those products are sold online. So it's a very, I'm giving a complex answer to what I think was a great question, but I haven't seen many studies. And again, I'm not sure if consumers are incentivized enough in order to get away from the convenience of the online space, and the fact that a lot of times a lot of these marketers are using these value propositions that are very clear: cheaper, easier to access, no prescription. It's hard to combat those types of value propositions.
And yeah, I agree. That's a really good question, because incentivization on any level when it comes to consumer products, no matter how valuable or invaluable the commodity, adds a bit of pride to what it is that you're doing as a consumer, right? That
Mhm.
purchasing, that selling factor. We all like that as humans, and that's probably something to carry forward as we go on. And we have another question from William, who asks, what is the online impact of fake drug distribution in less developed nations? And I believe you touched on that a little bit. And is it a meaningful factor?
Yeah. So what we see in least developing countries or low to middle income countries is we see, a lot of the counterfeit distribution is related to disease prevalence. So, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa or in Southeast Asia, there have been hundreds of studies done on counterfeit antimalarials, And that's because the prevalence of malaria is pretty high in those spaces. And also, one of the major areas of financing in the global health space is through public health interventions through things like the Global Fund and other UN related partners that focus on, supplying anti-malarials to those spaces to those different countries. So the fact that there's a lot of anti-malaria product getting in there, a lot of it gets diverted, and there's a high prevalence of those diseases means that there's always going to be a potential for counterfeiting. So in least developing countries, you definitely see counterfeiting that cuts across everything. We have heard that there is counterfeiting of opioids and other products as well. It's just not as well picked up. But what the international community is more focused on are those counterfeiting that relates to a public health outcome. And frankly, a lot of the money that's being spent in those areas are in kind of international development aid and health development assistance for health, for example, and that is spent on certain pharmaceuticals, and those tend to be the ones that are counterfeited. And there's, supply and demand components as well. There's pricing issues as well. So, if a lot of people can't, in least developing countries, afford very expensive medicines, they're probably not going to be counterfeited as much versus products that are being subsidized or being provided by another international government or an agency. Those are going to be counterfeited because they're going to be more available on the market. And then, of course, the consequences for counterfeiting in least developing countries, I wouldn't say it's worse, but it carries a different weight because if you are a person who has very low income, is and is just trying to make a living, and you have a disease, and you go to your community pharmacy and you take a counterfeit drug, and it makes you sicker or even worse, then that can impact your whole family. That can impact your whole income dynamics, and that can really cripple communities. So we see a little bit less resilience in that space, especially when it comes to these drugs that are counterfeited that deal with life-saving issues like malaria or HIV or other types of public health challenges.
That's a great question that touches on a very complex issue because, like you just alluded to, it's something a little bit broader than just the counterfeit itself, right? These people have to make a livelihood, and then the butterfly effect that occurs from that little incident.
Mm-hmm.
And we have another question from Kevin Chow, who asked, after China and India, what other countries are large players in the counterfeit pharmaceutical sales?
Well, I think that's an interesting question, but I guess the important thing to kind of consider is what aspect of that supply chain are you talking about? Because what we saw in certain studies that we did, where we looked at more controlled test buys, things like that, is the internet pharmacy may be located in one space and may be operated out of one particular company. That company could have an ISP or a registered address if it's available, of course, and it's not masked from a more high income country, or the actual server could be located in the US. But when you actually buy that product, it's shipped or drop shipped from like India or China or even places like Singapore. And so there's a disconnect between what that online pharmacy is doing and where the product is actually coming from. So it's not as simple to say, I guess, that the problem is one place. It's actually an ecosystem of different sellers and different providers and services that enable a person to buy that drug. The supply may come from India, but the marketing of that website may be by another party from another country. So we see that in the opioid space as well, where precursors are coming from certain countries, but that finished product maybe being produced in Mexico or Canada, and then it's being shipped into the U.S. and being locally distributed by organized crime or even just DIY drug dealers in the marketplace. So to say that it's maybe one country or another, I'm not sure that's exactly the right approach to think about it, even though certain countries do supply more API or pharmaceutical precursors or things like that. But it's really this whole value chain that is enabled that allows for criminality to occur. If these different disparate actors didn't have access to each other, couldn't have their services and the collaboration, I'll say collaboration is a bad word for this type of space, but they couldn't have that coordination facilitated by technology, then a lot of this trade, I think, would be harder to do. So again, certain countries I think are definitely specific to a supply. Certain countries are more specific to marketing or the actual space that the drugs are sold, and then certain countries are more specific to that ground game where this product is actually being sold in a community pharmacy or by a drug dealer itself. So it's a very dynamic environment, and it is very therapeutic specific. Like one drug may have a different value chain than another, and it changes over time as well. And a lot of times that organized crime element is in that space as well, and that's what makes it so dangerous.
Great question, Kevin. Great question. I hope that answered it. We talked a little bit earlier about some of the stuff that you're doing in social media, but there are some specific things that are taking place in Snapchat. Would you like to allude to that at all? Speak on that?
Yeah, so we this is the something that's been made public, but our company S3 works with Snapchat to do external monitoring. So what we do is we look at other websites, other social media platforms, other spaces on the internet where someone is advertising to sell a drug, and they also include a Snapchat account associated with that advertisement or that marketing or that offer for sale, etc. And then we provide that information back to Snapchat in order for them to do more robust and more proactive internal surveillance on their platform, so they can action those accounts. And I'll just say, not giving too much information, but a lot of the preliminary data we see is the more proactive you are, the more harder you make it for certain sellers to stay on your platform. It is possible to, have users migrate over to other platforms. It doesn't mean that they'll ever necessarily go away. And it doesn't mean that new people that are, new to the drug selling space don't come back on your platform, et cetera. You have to be constantly vigilant of changes on your platform, but you can create certain deterrents that make it harder for sellers, and they decide to move to other platforms that are easier to sell on. Of course, Snapchat has had a lot of deaths related to people on their platform, young people. So that's maybe one of the reasons why they've taken a more proactive stance. But a lot of the other platforms where we see the same content, we don't see the same kind of change in volume, et cetera. And then the other thing I think that's very important about any platform doing this type of work, again, internal surveillance. So you want to do your own kind of content analysis, content mediation to make sure that stuff is not on your platform. Two, you want to have that external insight into what's happening on other platforms so that you can identify threats and risk characteristics that can improve your internal searches. And then third, you want that health promotion layer. You want to have some messaging on your platform to say, hey, you consumers, you users on our platform, be aware that this is happening, and you need to stay away from this content and be aware that these sellers are trying to poison you and kill you. So I think those are some best practices within the brand protection space as well. It's more on the technology and provider platform space, but we don't see all providers or technology platforms doing this. And again, a lot of technology platforms are really only concerned about what's happening on their platform. And our argument is you really have to have a whole of ecosystem understanding in order to do better surveillance on your own platform as well.
And that makes a lot of sense too, because you see the permeability between one social media site to another,
Exactly.
and how they pretty much have this, even though they're existing in different spaces like the companies, but they pretty much are interconnected in a way because the consumer is triangulating between all of those different things. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah.
And the other thing that we see is, one enforcement action on one platform can lead to changes on another platform. And a lot of times, if you don't have that visibility, and a lot of times enforcement actions by larger platforms are very periodic or sporadic. So they're not really impactful at all. Like those users that got their accounts taken down, they're just going to pop back up. And that's the problem. That's the real problem, whether it be Snapchat or whether it be other platforms. I mean, all these platforms still have a problem. And a lot of times the worst outcome for a drug dealer is to have their post removed and they pop right back up. So we still have an issue of lacking, we can collect data, we can, kind of characterize it in a way that can inform how you do better content moderation. But that second or third layer where we, provide more intelligence around actual investigations that can be actioned on this data is probably the most important part of kind of the technology side of what we do.
And I guess to kind of extend this a little bit, what for forward thinking, what are some of the impacts that you feel will be necessary to kind of mitigate this whole thing? Considering the vast majority of the increase in fentanyl sales and fentanyl deaths are kind of permeating not just the average drug user, but like
Mhm.
people, the younger people, the ones on social media. And in what way do you see this whole thing kind of wrapping up, shoring up to include more safety standards?
Yeah, there's a number of different, areas that could potentially help in this space. One is that, the platforms do have to take a more proactive role in, content moderation. And what I mean is proactivity, like not reactivity, but really focusing on one of the things we really stress is you have to have custom machine learning approaches to identify this content. So don't use off the shelf machine learning approaches, classifiers that are built for other things like spam or things like that. These markets are very dynamic, and you almost have to have a classifier for almost each type of drug product. That's how specific it is. So a lot of these platforms, it's important for them to invest in those resources. And I think one of the things that you can tell if a platform is really doing something in the space is the amount of investment they make, not just in the health promotion space, but in the technology investment space. And, working with external parties too, because a lot of these platforms believe that they understand the full issue, but a lot of times they don't, because again, they're not seeing what's happening on other platforms. They're not understanding the dynamics of how these things change. So they're addressing it only in the context of their platform. Two, there is legislation, that has been suggested in different spaces, whether it be, legislation to amend CD 230 to remove certain liability protection. And certain companies, have been moving along the line of saying that, they may be willing to look at this, may be willing to assess whether there may be some changes necessary. The complexity of that is that it impacts everything on the internet, not just drug sales. It impacts all types of content, related to other things like cyberbullying or other type of trafficking. Human trafficking, one of those exceptions because there's already laws around that. But gun sales, for example. So I think that policy discussion is very important. Even if policy doesn't get enacted, it can shape how platforms decide to address content moderation, because perhaps they're going to want to engage in more self-regulation, and that will protect them from any type of potential liability down the road. So that, I think, is a very important component of looking at, that policy and legislation component. And then also, I think definitely, there has to be a little bit better coordination. Now, it's understandable that a lot of these companies are competitors, so they can't just, collaborate on these different issues. But when we have a public health crisis like the fentanyl crisis, people are being poisoned. There's a space to collaborate that will directly impact patient safety and consumer health. And I think those are the carve outs in that space where you remove some of that, competitive component, and you really start working together to try to take this whole ecosystem down at the same time and together. And we saw a little bit of that with COVID, whether it be misinformation or whether it be digital contact tracing, Apple and Google coming together and building digital contact tracing apps. Companies that traditionally compete with each other, coming together to address public health issues. And so I hope that that is one of those spaces of active collaboration. And I hope that, researchers like myself, we can be a part of that collaboration because we do have a lot to add. So I think that's hopefully where it goes. But, it may be legislation that gets us there first. I'm not sure.
I think that's really great too, because that's one of the main things that we've seen is that, and especially during the times of COVID, the collaboration between these social media groups uh, to kind of counteract disinformation, misinformation, and we've seen that space in between where, like you alluded to, this is a public health crisis, and in public health crises, there is room, right, to let all the cards down and just come up with something. And there's a great saying that the best defense is a great offense, and that comes with what you said, being proactive in the fight against these things in all spaces, in brand protection, anti-counterfeiting, and with this permeating such a broadened level of health, right? I think it's important to have, like you said, that collaboration amongst all of these different social media groups, and I believe
Yeah.
that's the space that can do that.
I think also that, if one company takes a very proactive stance, it could really have an impact on the industry itself, because then one company is setting the bar for what other companies should do in the space. And I think for brand holders, a lot of times there's just a disconnect between how you communicate to a technology platform and what is required of them to remove content or to investigate content. And I think that dynamic is slowly changing on different types of product classes. It may not be the same for fentanyl as it is for like a consumer product like consumer handbag or something like that. But that space is opening for conversation about how do you make our platform healthier and how do we protect the users on those platforms? Because a lot of these platforms don't want to have unhealthy experiences for their users. And maybe that's a competitive advantage as well. That's one of the things we argue, a lot is that if you take care of the fentanyl issue on your platform, not only are your users not going to die and you're not going to have all this bad PR, but you're going to create a more healthy space for conversations that are relevant, such as real conversations about substance use disorder and reducing the stigmatization associated with that, addressing health inequalities, things like that. And that space will be safer because you won't have drug dealers coming into those conversations and trying to sell drugs to these people. And that's what we see. So that risk environment, communicating to platforms that it's in their best interest to create a more healthy ecosystem, and it will be better even maybe for the bottom line. I think that conversation is evolving, and hopefully it will, take hold a little bit better.
That's a great thing to add to. I agree with that. And we have about 10 minutes left here. And this is an opportunity for you to talk about some of the outreach and education work that you've done with these public or health providers.
Yeah, a lot of our, outreach. So we're an academic lab. We're a company by the NIH, and I prefer to be a researcher, to be honest. I prefer to write papers. I prefer to, do those things. But, the process of commercializing this research over the last, 3 years has been really challenging. You have to it's not just research that you need to do, but you need to translate in a way that helps somebody use it. And that's oftentimes very difficult. At the same time, you need to translate what you're finding to the lay audience to understand how people perceive that risk and communicating to them in a way that they can understand it. So recently I was on Dr. Phil, for a brief segment. And, it was really hard because a lot of the victims' families were up there talking about their experiences, which is heartbreaking. And you really need that exposure to understand what's going on and how serious this issue is. And so communicating in a way that, the public can understand, hey, this is a risk. Here's like 3 points of, this is what you should be looking out for if you're a parent, for example. Understand what your teenager or your young person's information diet looks like. Like, take an investment and look in that. If they're using Discord or Telegram or these other encrypted apps, have a conversation about why are you using those apps. Look for, common things like delivery of packages. Like, make sure those packages are things that you understand what's supposed to be in them and what people are ordering. And then these high stress periods, like when students are going through finals, we see an increase in people looking at sales of Adderall, for example. And Adderall can be laced with fentanyl. So taking the research beyond the kind of, research abstract and even the commercialization part, and really focusing on these key points that consumers can understand and latch onto and hopefully reduce their risk. So that's a lot of what we're trying to do, kind of in the translational side of it. And it includes a lot of media, includes a lot of talking to reporters, includes a lot of, really breaking down what the issue is. And, National Fentanyl Awareness Day was one of those opportunities to really get that message out there. So really hope that will have an impact on people saying, well, I'm not going to buy drugs online because I don't want to be poisoned. And lots of partners that were involved in that. We were just one small one. And that's what's needed more, but across a lot of different public health issues, not just fentanyl, although that's one of the worst ones we're dealing with right now. But hopefully we can replicate that model and use it for other public health challenges.
Oh, absolutely. I figure, me as a journalist, one of the major things that researchers and scientists have an issue with is communicating that research and science to the public in a manner which is easily digestible. And that's usually a job for us, but it's more than likely a better way for those in the space to kind of do that too. And I think it's helpful that you touched on taking those key points and giving them to those people that are directly involved. I can only imagine how hard it must have been just being up there speaking with some of the victims of some of these things, and having the knowledge and the foresight to kind of prevent these things, right? But I think it's amazing work that you guys are doing in order to prevent these things from happening. As we kind of wrap up here, is there anything that you'd like to add that we hadn't touched on that you feel like is valuable to the audience that's still here?
Yeah, just a reiteration for the brand protection community that, it's really important to understand how these markets are very specific with using different online medium. Again, wildlife is very different from gun sales, very different from drugs. So you really have to have that subject matter expertise that is associated with understanding what those markets look like. And then what we believe in is, human intelligence assisted with machine intelligence. So it's the combination of those two. It's not one or the other that will really address brand protection or counterfeiting or any of those issues. It's, the power of having, big data, machine learning, and generating insights that a human analyst can look at and understand and always follow those markets and understand how those trends are changing and how you adapt that data layer to more dynamic data collection